Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be across the globe. We are so glad that you're joining us once again for Stories and Myths. I'm your co-host, Craig Von Buzik, and my fellow co-host is John Farrell, also known as John C. Farrell. How are you this evening, John C. Farrell?
I'm doing well. Just add that to the many nicknames that you give me almost on a daily basis now. So,
It's your actual name. Hold now.
well,
Now, why
yes.
do I know that it's John C. Farrell?
Did you not know that my middle name started with the C prior
I
to
don't
tonight?
know if I did, but now I know it's John C. Farrell. And this is the reason, ladies and gentlemen, John C. Farrell has written the book, the official NASCAR trivia book. And we are going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this program. But I wanted everyone to see, because last week they could have gotten the wrong impression that I wasn't interested in talking about your book. I am very interested in talking about your book. I just didn't want to talk about, NASCAR history without talking about your book, because this is NASCAR history, right?
I understand, and that book was published in November of 2012. So it was published by Random House in 2012, and so it's been out for a couple of years, but it is no longer in circulation. But it is able to be picked up and found on Amazon.
Well, if it's able to be purchased on Amazon, then it is in circulation.
Right, yeah, it's in circulation. You just can't get it from Random House or from a bookstore anymore, unless you went to a secondhand book store, something like that. But
Interesting. Well, but you just to clarify for our audience, because I know many people want to know, they can buy a new copy on Amazon.com.
yes.
Okay.
If
Very good.
absolutely.
All right. So you had a very interesting and exciting week this week. Tell us,
I did.
where did you go, and what did you think of it?
I did. My lovely wife and I had the opportunity to go up to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They have a Sight and Sound theater up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and it's one of their two facilities. They have one in Branson, Missouri as well. But for 2011 or 2021, wow, going back to into the time machine, but 2021 they're doing a show in Lancaster called Queen Esther, which obviously is about the Book of Esther in the Bible. And so we got to go up there and see it. And my first impression was, this is coming from someone. I've been in community theater and doing community theater for close to 40 years. I have a theater. My minor is in theater design, and I continue to do theater. And I traveled all over the world doing theater with a group called
With who?
Up with People.
That's awesome.
Right. He makes fun of it every time I mention it.
No, it's an encouragement. You meet them wherever you go. That's what I've heard.
Right. Yes, you do meet them wherever you go. And I love the mission of Up with People. But I've done theater. For what I was trying to say is, so I've done a lot of theater in my life, and I've been to many Broadway shows and Broadway productions up in New York City, as well as touring shows. And when the curtains were raised at Queen Esther at Sight and Sound Theater up in Lancaster, my jaw almost hit the floor. I was in awe. It was one of the most incredible sets I have ever. Actually, no, it was the most incredible set I've seen. That blows any Broadway production set that I've seen out of the water. It was amazing. The production value of it was awesome. Everything, just to give you an idea, the amount of stage space that they use is 11,000 square feet of stage space.
Wow.
And it's not only just in front of you, but it's on all three sides of the audience. And I had great seats. I was second or third row from the bottom of the balcony, almost dead center. And everything about it just blew every expectation, every thought that I had I would see. It just blew me out of the water. It was absolutely phenomenal. And so just give it a plug. If you ever have the opportunity to go see a Sight and Sound theater production, whether you're in Branson, Missouri, or Lancaster, Pennsylvania, go. It is well worth the price of admission. And
so
this
you're going to be
year,
writing an article
yes,
review of your experience on inspiration.org.
yes. And actually, just to tell you how impactful it was to my wife and myself, my wife, as we're driving back to our hotel that night, she goes, I know what I want for my birthday every year. I want tickets to go see this. I was
Oh,
like,
wow.
absolutely. I would love to. Right. It was great. So the show that they're doing in Branson for 2021 is Jesus, which is the show that they had in 2020 at Lancaster. So they run the kind of the second year of a show in Branson. So I'm imagining Esther will eventually go to Branson, Missouri. And then they've already announced their 2022 production for Lancaster, and that is David, which sounds phenomenal. I'm stoked to go see that too. So it was very, very cool.
Very good.
Kelly Williams Duncan says, hello, gentlemen, and that she used to live in Lancaster County.
Oh, wow. Cool.
One of the things that we're kind of bummed that we didn't get to do, and it was just our poor planning, is we wanted to go to a real Amish market and kind of drive around the Amish countryside and realize that, well, we didn't get there till Saturday afternoon, so we had to go almost directly to the theater. And so we were like, okay, well, Sunday we'll wake up and go do the Amish kind of touristy thing. And they practice the Sabbath, which good for them, but bad on us for our poor planning, because we didn't get to do anything Amish related. So, and we stopped
since you're going for your wife's birthday, you can plan to do that next time.
Yes, and we plan to actually. It was just a date trip with me and for my wife and I, and so we're planning to take our boys back. We have 2 boys. We plan on taking them back with us next time, just because we think they both love the theater too, and they both do theatrical stuff too. So I think they would really enjoy it as well. So
very good.
Looking forward to my next trip up there.
Excellent. Well, another exciting thing that happened this week was the 199th birthday of General President Ulysses S. Grant. So that happened on April 27th. And so next year is going to be the bicentennial of the birth of Ulysses S. Grant. So we'll definitely be celebrating that and talking about that as we continue to promote the 2 books. One is the biography, which you can see behind me there. Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, which is a focus on the last 2 years of Grant's life. And then the other book is coming out in May 25th, and that is called Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. So we'll be talking about both of those books as time goes by. But what do we got on the agenda tonight?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Grant's alcoholism and whether he really had a problem with alcohol, and kind of the myths and the stereotypes that kind of went around with that, as well as we're gonna dabble just a little bit about our personal experiences with 9/11. And you have a really unique story and perspective on 9/11,
and so
I have a different story about 9/11. And we'll get into that a little later. But first, we're going to talk about his relationship with Abraham Lincoln, or Ulysses S. Grant's relationship with Abraham Lincoln and his drinking problem. And then we're going to close out with a little anecdote from NASCAR. So
from what book will that be referring to?
Right. So for those who weren't here.
No. I need to know, what book are we going to be referring to? The official NASCAR trivia book by John C. Farrell.
Right.
That is exciting.
Absolutely. So at Amazon now, and no longer in bookstores, but brick and mortar bookstores.
Hey, as long as you can get it on Amazon, you can still get it.
Yeah, absolutely. So unless you have any questions or any issues with me going ahead diving into the questions, Craig, I have a question for you if you're okay with.
Well, I just want to say, anyone wants to ask any other questions beyond what we are planning to share tonight, feel free to do so in the comment section or you can email those to us, and you could do that through my website, vonbusick.com. That's VONBUSECK.com. Just go right at the top. You'll see a contact link at the top of the website, and you can send that question. So go ahead, shoot.
Absolutely. So, obviously, as I alluded to earlier, there's rumors of Grant's drinking that hounded him throughout his life, and even still today, there's still kind of some, I guess, a school of thought that he was an alcoholic. What, for once and for all, settle it. What is the truth behind his alcoholism, and was he an alcoholic?
Well, I can only share what has been settled by someone else, and that was Ron Chernow. In his book on Grant, which is a biography of his entire life, one of the things that he set out to do was to prove once and for all what the situation was with Grant's drinking. And so let me just tell a little bit of a story of what happened, and then share Chernow's conclusions, which I agree with. So what happened is that Grant was raised in a strict Methodist home. And so they were, I don't know if the father drank, but I know that the mother did not. She was a very strict Methodist. And so Grant didn't have a lot of alcohol when he was growing up. But of course, after he went to West Point as a cadet, well, there was plenty of temptation, not actually on campus, but they would sneak away to the village nearby where they would have whiskey and whatever at this little pub. And so he probably got his first taste of liquor there. But it wasn't a problem for him because the rules were so strict, you could actually get kicked out of West Point if you were caught. So he didn't want to risk that. So fast forward, he ends up being assigned to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And while he's there, his former roommate, Frederick Dent, introduced Ulysses to his family, including his sister Julia, who was in school at the time in St. Louis. But it was pretty much love at first sight for both of them. They really fell for each other very quickly. And so Julia did not drink that I know of. If at all, it might have been very slight, but she was not a heavy drinker. And so they basically fell in love, and they pledged to each other their devotion. Grant wanted to ask for Julia's hand, but Julia's father, Colonel Dent, who wasn't really a military colonel, that was just a honorary title like Colonel Sanders, he was not keen on the idea of his aristocratic daughter being married to a soldier, because at that time, many of the soldiers were not paid very well. It was only after you moved up pretty high in rank before you started making some serious money. But at the same time, they were stationed all across the country and a lot in the West. So it was a dangerous life, but it was also not a very good paying job. And so Julia said, let's wait and let you kind of accomplish some things to impress my dad, and then we can get engaged later on. And so just about that time, the war in Mexico was starting to unfold. And President Polk really instigated that war. By the way, Abraham Lincoln at the time was a first-term congressman from Illinois, and he was very much opposed to the Mexican War. He called it an unjust war. Ulysses S. Grant, in his personal memoirs, called it an unjust war, but he went and fought the war because he felt that he had been trained for free, no charge, by the government, and he had an obligation to the United States to fight on behalf of the nation, even though he didn't agree with the war. So he went off to Mexico, and Julia stayed behind in St. Louis. And he actually was quite heroic in a couple of key instances, which we could talk about another night. But the U.S. was successful in its invasion of Mexico, and Mexico ended up surrendering to the United States. The United States ended up paying Mexico for the Western territory that it desired. And that territory included much of Texas, all of Texas, much of Utah, Nevada, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. So it was a huge tract of land that had been Spanish territory, then it was Mexican territory, and now it would become part of the United States. So once the war was over, the government had to keep the army in place until everything was agreed to and they knew that the war wouldn't flare up again. So now Grant is stationed in Mexico, far from his love of his life, and it started to get very boring. And so they would do these different excursions. So Grant and his friend Simon Bolivar Buckner took a team of guides and some donkeys, and they climbed up one of it's the largest volcano in North America, Popocatépetl, which I've actually seen with my own eyes when I went to Mexico with Operation Blessing and the Flying Hospital when I worked at CBN.
Cool.
And it is an amazing sight. I mean, you just can't hardly believe how huge this volcano is.
And bigger than anything we have in Hawaii?
Well, in the continental United States.
Okay.
Yeah, in North America. Actually, the largest mountain in the world is the mountain there on the Big Island of Hawaii, which I've also been on top of that mountain, Mauna Loa, I believe it's called. And people would say, well, what about Mount Everest? Well, Mount Everest is the tallest from the surface of the earth, dry earth up. But Mauna Loa goes from the base of the Pacific all the way up. And it's actually, when you measure it from that height, it's actually taller than Mount St. Helens, or not Mount St. Helens, but Himalaya. Mount Everest. Yeah. So at any rate, but, you know, after a while, Grant ran out of things to do. And so almost all of the soldiers started to enjoy the tequila and the whiskey. And I mean, they were bored. And so they started to drink. And unfortunately, this was the beginning of Grant's alcoholism. So the answer to your question is yes. Ron Chernow, in his investigation, said there's no doubt that Ulysses S. Grant was an alcoholic, using today's definition. They didn't call it that back then. But he took all of the evidence to his brother, Ron Chernow did. And his brother is a medical doctor, and he presented the evidence from history to his brother, and his brother said, it's a textbook case. He was an alcoholic. Wow. Right. So when Grant was released to go back to St. Louis, by this time he was a decorated veteran and a war hero. And Zachary Taylor thought he was an excellent soldier, as did Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, the head. That was his nickname.
Old Fuss and Feathers.
Yeah, he was very large man, very rotund, and he loved to get decorated up and ride on his horse in parades. And so he was a great general, but they called him Old Fuss and Feathers. But he respected Grant as well. And so Grant came home with laurels, and he was a lieutenant at that time. And so now, his fame preceded him, and his father said, okay, he can marry my daughter because it looks like he's got some character.
Oh, wow.
And so Grant made a pledge to Julia that he wouldn't drink. And the truth of the matter is that as far as we know, for the rest of his life, he didn't touch the bottle when Julia was around. But there was a lot of times when Julia was not around. Right. And so they were sent out after they were married. They were sent up to the shores of Lake Ontario, to a garrison up there where everything was good. But then Julia became pregnant with their first child, and she ended up having the baby back in St. Louis, leaving Ulysses in New York, and he started to drink. And so then he was transferred to Detroit. And again, Julia would go and visit both of the grandparents to show them the baby. Ulysses' family was in Ohio, and her family was in St. Louis. And so when she was gone, he started to drink again. And he felt guilty because he had made this promise. But the problem with Ulysses was twofold. One was that alcoholism is a disease. And so once you start drinking, it is very difficult, if you have that disease, to stop. The second thing was that Grant was about 5'7", and he weighed 100 and nothing pounds. I think at that time he was probably in the range of 110 to 120, very thin. And so he couldn't keep his alcohol. He got drunk very quickly. And so what happened is that there was a major temperance movement that was sweeping the country called the Washingtonian movement. And there was a speaker, and I can't remember his name, but I actually have an entire chapter on Grant's alcoholism in my book, Forward, The Leadership Principles of U.S. Grant. And it talks about this person who had been very successful, but then he got into drinking, and he lost his wife, he lost his child, and so they wouldn't have him back. He was permanently separated from his wife and child, this speaker. And so he ended up going out on the speaking circuit to warn people, to say, don't allow yourself to fall into alcoholism. I am now part of the temperance movement, the Washingtonian movement. And he would go from town to town to get people to sign up. And so when Grant saw him speak, he was very moved by his message, because to Grant, the most important thing in his life was Julia and Fred. And he was frightened by the prospect of the alcoholism causing him to lose his family. And so he became very strongly abstinent at that point. And he remained so for an awful long time, until he was sent by the Army out to the West Coast. And when that happened, back then there was no transcontinental railroad. So they had to take a ship from New York City down to Panama, and then they would cross the Panama Isthmus, sometimes on a train, sometimes just on mules or horses. And because it's tropical, it was always full of cholera and dysentery and other tropical diseases. And so a lot of people would die going across the isthmus. Well, just after they found out that Grant was transferred, Ulysses and Julia found out that Julia was pregnant. And so there was no way that they were going to allow her to go to Panama being pregnant and with their young son, Fred. That would be like saying you get to go through a COVID ward with no mask on, and you're 75 years old. There's certain things you just don't do. And so, so Grant had to kiss his wife and his son goodbye, and he went to California. And sadly, out west, it was again very boring. They would do their duty, which took them about 3 or 4 hours, whatever the daily chores were. And then the rest of the day, they had nothing to do. And that was not a good thing, along with the fact that Grant was away from Julia. And again, the temptation was great, because pretty much all of the soldiers drank to an excess. The other side of that is that Grant wanted very badly to bring Julia and his, eventually 2 sons, Fred and Ulysses Jr., who was born in Ohio. So they called him Buck for the Buckeye State. So he wanted to bring them out to the West Coast, but he he couldn't afford it on his military salary, which in that his father-in-law was correct. He was not making enough money to be able to transport them safely, and it wasn't safe to bring them across land. Really wasn't safe to bring them across the Panama Isthmus. So Grant felt totally trapped. And so he started different schemes to try to bring them out there. So the first was he planted this big crop of potatoes, and they did extremely well until there was a late spring thaw, and all this water came rushing down the mountainside and ruined all the potatoes. So then he invested in a friend's restaurant in San Francisco, and the guy took the money and left, leaving Grant with nothing. Then the final scheme was he heard that they were bringing ice down from Alaska on steamships. And so he invested in this scheme to bring ice from Alaska down to San Francisco. But unfortunately, the steamship broke down on the way and all the ice melted and he lost everything. So after this series of unfortunate events, he fell into a very deep depression. And that's when he started to really drink because he didn't see any hope. And there was no possibility of him going back east. In fact, he was sent north to Northern California, or I'm sorry, sent south to Northern California, appointed to this Fort Humboldt in California. And at that point, he was given the promotion to captain. But again, he was so depressed and there still wasn't enough money that he started to drink. And now, unfortunately, he started to drink while he was on duty. And because he couldn't hold his liquor, it became obvious. People who saw him described him. Several of them used the term stupid drunk. He would just, because Grant was a buttoned up, very conservative Methodist when he was sober. But when he got drunk, he started to act like silly and foolish. And unfortunately, his commanding officer was pretty much a martinet, meaning that it was everything by the book and it had to be exactly according to Hoyle or else you're out. And so after the second time of being caught drunk on duty, he said to him, all right, you either are going to be court-martialed or you need to resign. And Grant couldn't imagine being court-martialed, so he resigned. And he ended up not having any money to get back to St. Louis. So fortunately, because he was such an excellent quartermaster, there were other quartermasters who had been working with him and impressed with him. And so they were able to get him passage for free back to New York on the government dime, even though he had been kicked out of the army or he had resigned. But once he got to New York, he had no money and he was too embarrassed to ask for money. So there is a possibility that somehow he ended up in prison. We don't know the details on that, but some of the literature seems to say something happened. Maybe he was drinking and got in prison, but his friend, Simon Bolivar Buckner, the same one that he went up to the mountain with in Mexico, somehow found out about this and went, and I'm not sure if he bailed him out of prison or if he just met him somewhere, but he ended up loaning Grant the money to get back home. Once Grant got back home, he stopped drinking, and he stopped drinking for a long, long time.
Wow.
And then it was during the Civil War that he had a couple bouts where he fell off the wagon, but his wife was with him most of the time, or much of the time, I should say. And then also Grant had asked the lawyer for his father's leather goods store, his name was John Rawlins, if he would become his chief of staff when Grant was promoted to brigadier general. And Rawlins knew that Grant had a problem with drinking, and Rawlins had his own father was an alcoholic and had died very young, most likely because of alcoholism. So Rawlins made Grant promise. He said, I will be your chief of staff if you promise not to drink. And for the most part, Grant kept that promise. There were a couple occasions where he fell off the wagon. One in particular, Shelby Foote in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary said Grant went on a true bender during the Vicksburg campaign. What had happened is that his doctor had prescribed wine for a cold, or brandy or something like that. And again, when you're an alcoholic, one sip, you're in trouble. And so he took this sip of brandy for his cold, and then he didn't stop drinking. And when John Rawlins found out about this, he lit into Grant and said, "You promised that you wouldn't drink." And Grant said, "You're right." And immediately Grant apologized, and he sent for Julia. And then much of the rest of the war, he kept Julia close to him so that he wouldn't drink, because he knew that he could have been fired if he got caught. But he didn't. Right. And then after the war, he started to really overcome it. And before he became president, he pretty much was abstinent and remained primarily abstinent for the rest of his life.
So it seems that he had several episodes where he would temporarily get stop drinking, and then eventually circumstances led him back to drinking. And you said that, correct me if I'm wrong, that finally towards the end of his life, he finally gave up drinking and became abstinent for good. How long a period was that?
Life. It was before he was president.
Oh, it was before he's president. Okay, so before
he was president, in the 1860s. Okay. He probably, and I don't have the details on this. If anybody does, please let me know. But he probably started to become abstinent right there after Vicksburg, because he knew that he had really blown it, and he immediately sent for Julia. And then there's I've not seen any evidence of drinking after that in the rest of the Civil War and then beyond.
Oh, okay. And keeping Julia nearby would remind, sort of, I guess, as a daily reminder, hey, I made a promise to her not to.
Well, I think it was both a reminder, but also, there is I think there was an emotional need that Grant had, and that was filled by Julia, by his children, and then through his faith. And that's one of the things modern day Alcoholics Anonymous has as one of their steps, a recognition of a higher power. And Grant had that. And so I think that the combination of those things and people like John Rawlins keeping him accountable really helped him to overcome.
That's good. That's awesome. I wish more and more people had that kind of support system around them.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and skip to our discussion of September 11th, because I know that we have limited time this evening because you have another engagement after this.
I do. Yes, the NFL draft is tonight, and I have friends coming over to watch the NFL draft, and
you can't miss that.
No, I have to be a host.
So let's switch gears. What brought this up is that John and I were working on our content calendar today for inspiration.org, and we schedule content months in advance quite often, especially holiday content. So we were looking over things, and it dawned on us a couple of major anniversaries are happening this year. One is the 20th anniversary, which is hard for me to even fathom, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on September 11th. And then the other one that's really fascinating, and it just dawned on me today, is the 70th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attacks. So you were telling me, and why don't you go first? You were telling me that your wife was in Washington, D.C. and had an interesting experience on September 11th, 2001.
Right. Well, and I have three sisters. Two of my sisters were actually living up in New York City at the time of 9/11. Excuse me. Unfortunately, I was in grad school and class, and the way I was introduced to it was I was told that we had just gotten to class. It was early in the morning. It was a 9 o'clock class, I believe, and our professor walks in, and it was English degree. It was an English major program, and so there's a bunch of English grad students in my class, and the professor walks in and goes, "The towers have been struck," and you tell a bunch of English grad majors this, and you're thinking, what are you talking about Tolkien
Yeah, it
for?
sounds poetic literature, like poetic literature.
Right. And so that was my first thought, and that was many of our other people's first thought. Is like, what are you talking about? And then he explained what happened. And so, knowing that I had two sisters in New York City, I spent the next couple hours trying to call them. And of course, if you try to call anyone in New York City on that day, all the phone lines were down. It turns out that my oldest sister was her office building was just down the street from one of the World Trade Centers.
Wow.
And I don't know if she was in the office. I don't think she was, but her windows got blown out when one of the towers collapsed. And then my youngest sister, who had just finished, she went to acting school up there, and she had just finished, or she was working as a waitress, literally a starving artist up there in New York City. But her roommate was a temp in a company that was in one of the towers that fell. And I frantically tried all day long to try to reach them. And I finally heard from my parents that my oldest sister was fine, but hadn't heard from anybody about my youngest sister. So finally, at about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock the next morning on September 12th, I finally get a hold of her, and she miraculously answers her phone.
Wow.
I'm like, where are you? She's like, oh, I'm in a bar celebrating life. I'm like, what are you talking about? And so she's like, my roommate was supposed to go into work today, and she decided to play hooky at the last minute. Wow. And didn't go into the office. And so therefore we're out of the bar enjoying or celebrating the fact that she's still here with us. It's like, oh, wow. And then my fiance, who is now my wife after we've been married for 17 years.
Less than 20.
Yes, less than 20, but we got married in 2002. So so that would be actually
you better get it right.
It would be 19 years.
She's probably watching over in the kitchen, so you better get it right.
And I'm usually the one that's good with the dates and all that stuff. And she always looks at me as like, how long have we been together? How long have we been married? But it'll be 19 years of marriage this June.
Wedded bliss, marital bliss.
Of marital bliss, absolutely. And so, but anyways, she was working right outside of DC, a couple miles away from the Pentagon, and she got a phone call from one of their offices at the company she worked for up in New York City. And the guy who called her said, "Hey, will you let the CEO know that the towers have been struck?" And she was like, "Okay." So she went and told the CEO and was like, "Okay, what are we supposed to do about it?" And so they're like, "Well, let's listen to the radio and see what's going on." And just at that time, they were talking about how there was all these airplanes that were flying overhead, and they had been trying to communicate with them, and there were several planes that weren't able to communicate, and so they had no clue where they were going and what their targets were, and if they were really things. There's, as you can tell, in chaos, there's a lot of panic going on, and a lot of what's going on. You're not really clear. And so what happens is they listen to the radio, and they're listening. Oh, the plane's over this place. The plane's over this place, and the plane flew directly over her apartment that she lived in at that time, and actually flew over her office where she was at, and the building officer manager would lock their building down and would not let them leave the building. And so they were looking outside the window and could see smoke from the Pentagon going in the air shortly thereafter, because I think she said that there was this huge she could hear the sound of the plane hitting the Pentagon, and it was just a big thud. But it wasn't like so, because it was still a couple miles away, so it wasn't overly loud, but like, what was it? It kind of sounded like
Something different.
maybe a generator exploding or something like that. And so, but they were looking out the window and watching the smoke rise. And it wasn't until later that day, several hours after that, they were even able to go out to the car. And they said, when you get out to the car, you need to go out in large groups and drive immediately home. So, fortunately, being her fiance and being extremely concerned that, oh my gosh, my future bride might be part of this attack or might be a victim of this attack, because we honestly had no clue if there was other planes in the air, because there was reports of all these different aircraft over that space, and they had sent out the government had sent out a couple of their military planes to try to bring down things. And I don't think it ever escalated to that, because I think by then the one plane that obviously hit the Pentagon had already hit the Pentagon.
Yeah. A friend of mine actually was the one who gave the command for those fighter jets to go out after those airlines.
Oh, wow.
But they were too late.
Right. So, but fortunately, I was able to talk to her shortly after it happened, because apparently the phone lines to where she lived and where she was working were fine. So I was able to. But I remember I was a resident assistant or resident director for at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and I remember going up to the office where the Res Life offices were, and just holding myself up in an office and turned on the TV and just watched for hours. I don't know why I didn't go to my room or to my apartment that was on campus, but I think I needed to be around people.
Yeah.
And so even though I wasn't in a room with the people, I knew there was people outside the doors, because I was extremely, extremely afraid that something had happened to me. Because at this time, I hadn't talked to either my fiance or my two sisters that were up there.
So you said your wife saw the plane go over in the sky?
They heard the plane. They heard several different planes. They didn't see the plane, or they saw several planes, and whether one of the planes was one of the ones that hit the Pentagon, she doesn't know for sure. But she did see the smoke rising from the Pentagon.
Wow.
After it had struck the Pentagon. And my father-in-law, my wife's dad, who is now since passed, used to be stationed in the Pentagon, and his office where his office was two doors down, or two windows down from the edge of the impact.
Wow. Was he in his office at the time?
No, he had retired. He had been long retired.
Oh, okay.
But it was his office, and it was
so he knew the area very well.
Yeah, and it was always that my wife and my mother-in-law and him had walked several times. Him obviously all the time, but
wow. Well, I was on an airplane on September 11th, 2001. I had a conference that my boss and I were going to. I was working at the Christian Broadcasting Network at the time, and we were flying from Williamsburg Airport in Virginia down to Atlanta, and then from Atlanta to Chicago, where the conference was going to take place. And while we were in the air between Atlanta and Chicago, all three attacks happened. And of course, we're in an airplane, so we were not allowed to turn on our cell phones, and they did not tell us what was going on. So we landed at Midway in Chicago, and I don't know if you've ever been in that airport, but it's a very short runway, and so you come skidding with the brakes on, and there's a brick wall ahead of you that if you don't stop, you're going to hit the wall. And so, but I looked out the window, and I saw that at every gate, there was a police car, and they had their lights going. And I thought, what is the deal on this? And I don't mean the gates at the airport. I mean the gates around the perimeter of the airport. And I thought, that's weird. I wonder what's going on. So then the captain came on, and he said, ladies and gentlemen, we have landed here at Midway, and Right now, we're waiting for them to open a gate for us to taxi to. So at this time, you could turn on your cell phones. At that point, I realized I had left my cell phone back in Virginia, but everybody else was turning on their cell phones, and somebody said terrorists have struck the Twin Towers, and somebody else said terrorists have also struck the Pentagon. There are airplanes, and this is inside a cockpit of an airplane, and everybody starts yelling at the same time. And I turned to my boss, and we looked at each other like, oh boy. And so they finally taxied over to the airport, and we went up the ramp. And when we got inside the building, there was a National Guard soldier at every single door holding a machine gun and telling us where we needed to go so that nobody would go back out of the door. And so we head down the hall, and the news was on, and we watched, and we saw one of the towers fall. And we were like, oh my gosh. And the person next to us said, that's a rerun. It already has happened. And so we tried to get in touch with Virginia Beach, and Gordon Robertson, who was our boss, called and said, get back here immediately. We need you back here. And so we said, well, there's no airplanes to be had, but we'll see if we can get something else. So there was no trains, there were no buses, there was no airplanes. So then we thought, well, we'll rent a car and drive back. And when we got to the rental area, there was literally 1,000 people in front of us trying to rent a car. And we thought, there's no way that we can do this. So then we thought, okay, we'll go across to O'Hare, where our hotel was, and we'll figure out what we're going to do there. And so on the way over to O'Hare, we got in this van that the airport had provided. We were all shoehorned in there. And on the way over there, the radio was on, and Peter Jennings was saying, there's one airplane that is still unaccounted for in the sky, and it is not responding, and it's heading towards Chicago. So here we are in Chicago on the highway with an airplane heading towards us. And so the driver had been driving all night, and they called him back in to help drive. And so he started to fall asleep a couple of times on the highway. So we're swerving into the other lane. The guy in the front seat was like, hey, do you need me to take over? You need to wake up. And the guy's like, oh, sorry. He said, I drove all night, and so, but I'm awake. So we finally got over to O'Hare, and it was like a ghost town. Nobody was there, which is weird because normally O'Hare is jam-packed. And so we tried to get a rental car. The closest thing we could get was in Michigan on the other side of the lake. So we had to get over there. So my boss had gone to Wheaton College. So he called his old roommate and said, can you drive us over to whatever, Flint, Michigan, or not Flint, but on the other side of the lake in Michigan. And his boss or his roommate said, I've got some sort of thing going tonight, but I could get you as far as Gary, Indiana. So he drove us to Gary, Indiana, and dropped us off at a truck stop. But before we left O'Hare, I was able to get a hold of my parents, and my dad had been watching, and he knew that I had been flying to Chicago. And when he saw this happen in New York City, he turned to my mom and he said, I think we're going to be driving to Chicago to get Craig. That was before I ever called him. And so when I got a hold of them, they were not surprised at all. They were already getting ready to leave. And so we stayed, my boss and I stayed in this truck stop in Gary, Indiana, and they drove all the way up from Erie, Pennsylvania to Gary, which is like a 8 or 9 hour drive. And so I went in, we ate dinner there at the truck stop, which is always, good comfort food. But then I went in, they had this kind of like a theater that had the news playing on this large screen. And this room was filled with these truckers. And so I walked in and I sat down in an empty chair. And at one point, one of the truckers said, you fill my rig with TNT, I'll drive it right into Osama bin Laden's tent. And I thought to myself, this is the first time this whole day that I feel safe, surrounded by all these truckers. And so after a few hours, my parents showed up and they ended up driving us back to Virginia Beach. And that was my experience on September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
Changed our lives forever, didn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So,
well, now we've got to talk about this famous story. We're going to switch gears here in NASCAR history, which is in your book. What is the name of that book again?
So it's the official NASCAR trivia book that was published back in 2012
by John C. Farrell. Right there, you can see it. John C. Farrell.
So
and what's that?
I was going to say something. Go ahead.
My understanding is that at some point, one of the drivers, and this would never be allowed today, they would kick the driver out. But at one point, what was in the 50s or something, one of the drivers invited a monkey to drive with him. Why did he do that? And what was the deal? And did it ever happen again?
All right. Yeah. So first of all, you are 100% correct. With everything, all the regulations and all the sanctioning that NASCAR has in place today, it would never be allowed, not even a smidgeling of anything closely remotely close to what happened back in 1953. But before I talk about that, so this book is actually split up into 4 different sections. It has a since it is a trivia book, there's true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank, and the last section of the book is actually NASCAR facts and obscure facts, where this actual little anecdote falls in. And actually, that was my favorite part of when I put it together. I'd sit in Starbucks for hours on end and just do research and pour through tons and tons of archives and race annals and stuff like that. And so the actual last part of the book is my favorite part because it has some of these really crazy stories that that happened in the history of NASCAR. And I don't know if I said it last week, but I might if there's a race on and there's nothing else that I'm watching, I'll watch a NASCAR race nowadays. I'm not going and setting a date to see it, but I love the history of NASCAR, and that it is so colorful in the personalities that were allowed to race before a lot of the persons became basically billboards for corporate sponsors. And I understand that's how the sport has to be aligned or be created to survive. But anyways, in 1952, Tim Flock was the NASCAR Sprint Cup, or it was the NASCAR Premier Series champion. And so at the beginning of 1953, he was struggling a little bit and wasn't getting a lot of race wins and a lot of high finishes. And so his corporate sponsor had an idea while they were down in Atlanta. And so he went to a pet shop to buy a puppy for his family. And while he was at this pet shop in Atlanta, outside of I'm not quite sure what track they were racing at, but they were in Atlanta, and he saw this rhesus monkey, and he was like, wow, he felt drawn to it. It's like, you know what? I needed Ted Chester was a great marketing persona and personality. He just thought outside the box, which
way outside,
which is cool. And I admire that. And he's like, he saw this rhesus monkey. He's like, I need to team him up with Tim Flock and maybe just drive some notoriety and get some attention paid to him. So we're actually maximizing our exposure with that. So he buys this rhesus monkey and decides, you know what? Jocko Flocko is a great catchy name. And so he gives Jocko Flocko to Tim Flock to ride as a co-pilot in his car, which was a 1953 Hudson Hornet. And so they actually built a special seat on the passenger side, because if you've ever looked in a NASCAR stock car, it is basically the pilot seat or the driver's seat, and then really not much else.
Yeah, there's no real need for another seat.
Right, absolutely. And so they
I'm not
gutted
getting in there. I can tell you that.
right. So they gutted it all out, so it's as light as can be, or as light as it can be. And so they built this special seat for Jocko Flacco. They had a special uniform for him, and even I believe he even had a helmet that they put on him, and they even and so for the first couple races they raced in, not a lot of people knew about it, because he never told NASCAR, because NASCAR probably wouldn't have allowed it at the beginning, and so he raced a couple races, and in the first race, what they had done is they lifted the seat up high enough in the cockpit so the monkey could look out the window and wave to cars as they're driving by, and and I forget who it was, but someone has another competitor in that first race that he rode with him. I think it was Dick Passwater was his name, I think. But I know he was in that race. I think it was him that said this, but that he happened to look over at Tim Flock's car and see this monkey waving at him, and he almost ran into the wall, because it's the last thing you're expecting to see is a monkey in a race car.
Right.
And so he actually, Jocko Flacco actually raced with Tim Flock in 8 different races. And
wow.
And so once NASCAR got a wind of it, and other people in the sport knew about it, Tim didn't do anything to to hide the fact that he had a monkey in the car. He actually painted it on the side of his car that Jocko Flacco was in it. And then in Hickory, May 16th of 1953, he actually won with a monkey, with Jocko Flacco in his car. And so there's some great coverage from back then that says he was the fastest monkey on Earth or in the world or something like that.
Until they sent the monkeys up into space.
Right. So so that'll happen, and so the 8th race of that or the 8th race that Tim Flock raced with Jocko Flacco in his car was actually at Raleigh Speedway, which it might have been a new speedway, but regardless of whether it was or not, he was actually running the race in 2nd place. And back then, if you're familiar with the anatomy of a race car, they had these little trap doors in the floorboard of the car, and there's a chain on it that drivers could pull up to check the tire wear. And during the course of this race, Jocko got out of the seat that was made for him, and having seen Tim pull on this chain so many times, he decided to pull on the chain. And something got shot up. It depends who you ask, and whether it was a piece of the road or whether it was a chunk of the tire. Something hit Jocko Flacco and made him go crazy, and was just
Thus, the bad idea comes to full fruition.
Right. So the monkey was going all over the cockpit, like just freaking out. And someone had even said that it looked like, because they had seen it from the track, and they said it looked like there was a crazy bird in the cockpit that was just going wild. And so Tim Flock, who was in 2nd place in the race, had to actually make a pit stop to get the monkey out of the car. And so he's actually the only driver to have ever ridden with a monkey in a NASCAR race. He's the only person to ever won a race with a monkey in it, and he's the only person to ever lose a race or
because of the monkey,
or to have to make a pit stop to get rid of a monkey. And so he wasn't upset so much about having to get rid of the monkey, but he was more upset at the fact that having to make the pit stop dropped him down from 2nd place to 3rd place, which it also equated to a $600 drop in prize money, which at that time was a lot of money. And so he was a little upset about that. But unfortunately, it has a dark ending because Jocko Flocko never really got over that traumatic experience and had some kind of nervous condition or something and just never got over it and actually had to be euthanized
Oh, poor
shortly after
Jocko.
this incident just because of the
And
the
there were no
trauma.
monkeys in NASCAR cars after that.
Absolutely. And I'd like to say, although I know this is not the correct history of where the phrase "he had to get the monkey off your back," because I've heard stories where the monkey Jocko Flocko was actually clawing, like holding onto his back and clawing off his back. So I'd like to say, oh, that's where get the monkey off your back comes from. That's not true though, but it makes for a better story. I think.
But it's very entertaining. Well, Kelly writes in and says it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission with regard to putting the monkey in the car in the first place.
Right. No, absolutely.
Although today there would be no forgiveness, they'd just be gone.
Oh yeah, you'd have fines up the wazoo. You'd probably be suspended for a number of races.
Probably.
But the thing is,
you may be even banned and a major lawsuit, I would think.
Yeah, because PETA would probably step in too.
Not to mention NASCAR itself.
Right. Well, because while it was a very great marketing gimmick, it was a gimmick and a dangerous one at that. Because if Tim hadn't been such a skilled driver, like if it was me driving at those speeds and he had done that, I'd have probably wrecked and done considerable harm, not only to myself but to others,
and possibly to the other drivers or someone in the stands or whatever.
Two quick things about that.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that is once NASCAR knew about it, they didn't say anything. So because once it came out after like the second or third race that he was riding with a racist monkey, they never made him take the monkey out. And it was, from what I've read and what I've seen, what I've heard, is that it was mainly on it was Tim's decision to stop racing with the monkey, which was wise. So.
And all of this is shared in the famous book. Once again, the name?
The official trivia or NASCAR trivia book
by John C. Farrell.
Yes.
All right.
And it was published in November of 2012.
And that is available on Amazon. And also for those who are interested in learning more about Ulysses S. Grant, that is in my book, Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant, which has just been released by LPC Books, Iron Stream Media. And just quickly, Kelly has asked, did Grant return to the Army at Lincoln's request? And I'm going to say, stand by for the answer next week, because we are out of time. And I will answer that. That will be the first question I will answer next week. We gather here every Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern United States time. And so we invite you to be with us. If you're interested in ordering the Grant book, you could go to grantvictorbook.com. Once again, that's grantvictorbook.com. So for John C. Farrell, I'm Craig C. Von Buzik, and we will see you next week for Stories and Myths. Have a great week, everyone.